This time, we're talking about an unusual situation with migrant workers in China. Right now, China has just finished its Lunar New Year celebrations, and the people who were temporarily restricted during that time are once again coming to big cities to look for work. However, the Chinese economy is currently in a pretty dire state. The problem is that the people flooding into these big cities are finding it hard to secure jobs. There simply aren't enough opportunities. That's not to say there are no jobs at all, but compared to before, the working conditions have become much harsher. Amid this, specific recruitment details, like what kind of job postings are out there, are popping up all over the internet, drawing attention from various parts of China. This phenomenon isn't entirely absent in Japan either, but in China's case, the wage disparity between regions is enormous. In Japan, for example, hourly wages or starting salaries might differ between Tokyo and Tottori, and I think that's tied to the local cost of living. Renting a place in Tokyo is expensive, right? But in other regions, it might be half the cost or less. Naturally, salaries adjust to match those differences in living expenses. In China, however, that gap is huge. People are curious about how much you can earn in Shanghai versus Shenzhen, for instance. But just having a high salary doesn't mean much if the cost of living is so high that it cancels out the benefits. There are a lot of factors to consider. For migrant workers in China, especially, gathering information is incredibly important. That's why people are paying so much attention to the info surfacing online. There's a specific example from this year, right after the Lunar New Year, about Dongguan, a city that's distinct from rural areas in terms of circumstances. Let me introduce you to the kind of conditions companies in Dongguan are offering for hiring. Take, for instance, a certain electronics manufacturer in Dongguan. They're recruiting engineers aged 25 to 35. It's probably a factory, not just a company, but there's no dormitory provided, so they offer a housing subsidy of 100 yuan, about 2,000 yen in Japanese terms. Then there's a meal subsidy of 300 yuan, which is roughly 6,000 yen. As for the salary itself, it ranges from 5,000 to 10,000 yuan. In China, when you see 5,000 to 10,000 written, it typically means yuan, not yen, so that's about 100,000 yen. Some Japanese people might think, oh, that's surprisingly decent, given the image that labor costs in China are dirt cheap. But there's a regional difference at play here. In Dongguan, renting a tiny one-room apartment costs over 500 yuan a month. Of course, it depends on the quality of the place. For example, day laborers I've mentioned before might live in much cheaper spots, barely a step above just having a place to sleep. But if you're trying to live a little more comfortably, it's going to exceed 500 yuan. With only a 100 yuan housing subsidy, the rent burden is still pretty heavy. The cost of living varies depending on the lifestyle you choose. In Dongguan, they say a typical salaried worker's life requires at least 5,000 yuan a month, around 100,000 yen. So, with that engineer job offering 5,000 to 10,000 yuan, unless there's some special perk, it's likely closer to 5,000 yuan. That means your salary basically equals your living expenses. Compared to the past, these are really tough conditions. People used to earn more, but now in Dongguan, whatever you make just gets eaten up by living costs. That's the level of salary we're talking about. Still, for factory workers, being an engineer is considered one of the better gigs. There's also info from someone else who worked in Dongguan for a full year in 2024, sharing their monthly and annual earnings. I'd like to dive into those numbers. This person was a female migrant worker. The lowest monthly salary she earned last year was in February, 1,557 yuan, or about 30,000 yen. February tends to have more holidays, so earnings often dip. With 30,000 yen a month, you can't rent a one-room place on your own in Dongguan. She might have been sharing a room with others or possibly had a dorm provided by her employer, there's no detailed info on that. But at 30,000 yen a month, once you factor in living costs, you're in the red. Her salary fluctuated a lot, though. The highest month was December, when she earned 4,760 yuan, just under 100,000 yen. That's still not enough to rent a one-room place and live like a typical white-collar worker in Dongguan. December was her best month, but over the whole year, she made 45,364 yuan, roughly 900,000 yen. From a Japanese perspective, it's hard to judge whether that's a lot or a little. Some people think Chinese labor costs are super low, while others assume there are plenty of people earning more than Japanese workers. But the disparity in China is insane. There's a massive gap between the haves and have-nots. You might wonder how people survive with such differences. It's because lifestyles vary so drastically. In Japan, People with less money might eat at cheaper places, while those earning more go to nicer spots, but society isn't completely segregated. You might eat at Yoshinoya one day and a fancy Italian place the next. That's pretty normal in Japan. In China, though, low earners stick to super cheap options consistently, making do with whatever fits their budget. That's why perceptions differ so much. In China, it's not just about how much you earn, it's about how much it costs to live in a given city. In Shenzhen, a decent lifestyle costs around 100,000 yen a month now. If your salary falls short of that, you end up sharing a room with others. That's the current situation in Dongguan based on online info. The key point? Even if you work as a migrant in Dongguan, your entire salary gets wiped out by living expenses, leaving almost nothing in your pocket. On top of that, salary levels in Dongguan are starting to look a lot like those in smaller regional cities. It used to be that coming to Dongguan paid better than staying in a rural city, that's why people migrated. But now, the high cost of living outweighs the earnings, leading to a new phenomenon. What's happening is that people who came to urban areas are finding the conditions so bad that they're returning to their hometowns in droves. Are there jobs in those rural cities? Not really, but at least the cost of living is lower, so it's somewhat manageable. After the Lunar New Year, people left their hometowns to work in places like Dongguan, but now they're saying, this isn't worth it, and heading back. This isn't just a Dongguan thing, it's happening in Shanghai too. Normally, China's long-distance trains get packed around the Lunar New Year as people go home and then return to cities. But now, people who went to Shanghai are heading back to rural areas, causing train congestion in the opposite direction. Shanghai is widely regarded as China's economic hub, so if even Shanghai is like this, it shows how bad things have gotten. Major cities are seeing economic stagnation and can't absorb as much labor as before. If that's the case in big cities, the situation in smaller regional cities is even worse. This means unemployed people are piling up in those rural areas. Traditionally, migrant work in China conjures images of rural folks heading to urban centers. But now, it's not just that. People from mid-sized or small regional cities are also moving to massive hubs like Shanghai, Dongguan, or Beijing to find work. There aren't enough jobs in those smaller cities, and wages are lower compared to the big cities, so it used to make sense to move. But that's no longer viable. Right now, China's unemployed are stacking up in regional cities, stuck without jobs. What happens when that number grows? It leads to worsening security and a breakdown of order. Legitimate businesses can't survive anymore. When that happens, underground businesses, think drugs, prostitution, gambling, start thriving. Those turn into criminal organizations, of course. I think it's pretty certain that in the near future, especially in China's regional cities, order will erode, and crime will spike. Is China currently a place of order and safety? Not really, it's always been rough. Dark pools of influence have never gone away. People who can't find jobs and don't know how to survive are getting swept up into those groups, it's as clear as day. On this topic, I was chatting with the owner of an okonomiyaki restaurant the other day. He said that in China, the Communist Party has cracked down on street vendors, so even going back to your hometown to run a small business isn't an option anymore. If that's the case, the only path left might be joining the mafia. Thinking about it, what other ways are there to survive? The restaurant owner might be onto something. That's it for this discussion. See you in the next video.